Hello, time for the press preview then. A first look at what is on the front pages as they come into us here at Sky. Coming up, we'll check out the headlines with Pippa Crerar, political editor of the Daily Mirror, and Harry Cole, political editor of The Sun. We'll chat to you in a moment. First of all, let's take a look at some of those front pages for you. We'll start with the FT this evening, leading with the story on Sajid Javid's call to learn to live with the coronavirus. Bring it on, says the Daily Mail, referring to Mr Javid's vow to end lockdown restrictions. Well, the Eye is also leading on the new Health Secretary and his ambition to end restrictions on the 19th of July. And the Daily Express also leading on the end of lockdown restrictions, labelling Sajid Javid Mr Optimism. Now, Boris rewrites history. The Metro leads with the PM's suggestion that he did, in fact, sack Matt Hancock. And the Daily Star also leading with Boris's conflicting story on the departure of Mr Hancock. The Guardian says ministers are expected to announce an end to isolation rules for pupils in England. And the Telegraph highlights calls to end self-isolation and social bubbles for children in schools. Let's slide in the Times, saying pupils face a mobile phone ban to end classroom distractions. And The Sun leads on some gentle encouragement for Harry Kane ahead of England's Euros match against Germany. And I'm joined tonight by Pippa Crerar, political editor of the Daily Mirror, and Harry Cole, political editor of The Sun. Great to see you both this evening. Thank you very much for being with us this Monday evening. I know you were watching the football, Harry. We've dragged you away from it, haven't we? Let's start, shall we, with the Guardian then. In fact, the Guardian and the Telegraph both majoring on this story tonight. Pippa, ministers to end isolation for pupils in England. I mean, for a few days, indeed a few weeks now, there have been lots of rumblings that the whole system of bubbling in schools and children having to be sent home simply isn't working anymore and is almost getting out of hand. And I don't know about you, but as a parent, I'm getting emails from the school pretty much every day, and you sort of dread opening the email in case your kids are the latest to be sent home.
Yes, I've got 3 children, and touch wood, none of them have yet been sent home this time to self-isolate, but pretty much all their friends have. And we also have had those emails from school. So anecdotally, anybody that's a parent or has friends who are parents is clearly aware that this rise in cases that we're seeing, we're at the highest number of cases than we've had since January, I think it is at the moment, daily cases, is basically predominantly amongst young people and those who aren't yet vaccinated. So it is hitting the young worse. Obviously, they're less affected by COVID, thankfully, but they are inevitably being sent home and having to self-isolate. I think there was suggestions in The Guardian that 250,000 children missed school in a single week this month, which is a huge number. And when you consider that kids are really amongst those who have been most disrupted by this virus, and many of them really not spending as much time in school as the parents and as any of us would hope, it's had an impact not just on their education, but their mental health. And quite rightly and quite understandably, many parents and now government are concerned about what they're going to do about that going forward, and whether they can introduce some other system other than forcing them to self-isolate at home for 10 days and not to even leave the house. They're looking at, according to The Guardian, they're looking at bringing in testing for schools again in the way they did when schools first went back in March, for the return of schools in the autumn term, which would make a big difference and would definitely mean that children's education was less disrupted.
Yeah, Harry, also in this story in The Guardian, it mentions Sajid Javid, who I think had a pretty good debut in the Commons today by all accounts, but he could anger Conservative backbenchers, it says here, because he didn't rule out keeping measures such as masks and social distancing in place in schools. And it has the whole schools issue has become a real problem, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, Pippa's spot on. It clearly isn't working, and you're right to say there has been rumblings over the last few weeks. And also, we do have this absolutely massive testing capacity now. Not just the PCR test, but the lateral flow tests are available. The quick turnaround, 20 minutes, not as accurate, but still very quick results. So it does feel like, as part of the great push towards Freedom Day of July 19th, what a return to what Boris Johnson described today as normal as possible, something slightly echoed by Sajid Javid as well in his big debut, is, some things have got to give, and obviously this great big bubbling, sweeping classes out of school in and out. If there is testing capacity there, why not use it? Because we're not in the same level of people with symptoms going for tests as we were back in January, February, and March. So we might as well use this testing capacity and try and get back to as normal as possible. But you're right, good day for Sajid Javid. I think the Guardian has slightly played up the idea that the Tory MPs will be annoyed with him. I think he had them like putty in their hands today. That he looked a little bit like the cat that got the cream in the end. But even the most swivel-eyed of anti-lockdown, slightly sort of demented Tory MPs on the backbenches weren't too happy with what they heard. He was making all the right noises. But the problem is with this government, a little bit like Boris Johnson in the run-up to June 21st or June 17th, whatever it was saying, everything's fine. We don't see anything in the data not to do it until about 48 hours before, when they go, actually, no, we're not going to do it. But I do think the government are investing a huge amount of political capital now in this July date. And I do think if they were trying to pitch roll in any way to row back from it, they would be making very different noises than they are now. So they really are making their bed tonight and lying in it.
Yeah, we'll move on and talk more about Sajid Javid in a moment. But just to finish on the schools, Pippa, Daily Telegraph has got an interview with the Children's Commissioner as well. She's clearly extremely worried. And I suppose the problem for many parents is that many of them now have had both jabs. Many teachers have had both jabs. We know children aren't really that badly affected when they do get COVID. And I suppose many are saying, well, hang on a minute, we're going through all this disruption. Kids are having to go through yet more upset and trauma. And actually, why are they doing this when the vaccination programme now is so successful?
Yes, and of course, the next big question will be, will children be vaccinated? And the jabs have been approved by the regulators. The government, many in government, want to crack on and do this, particularly in the Department for Education. They obviously understand the sort of the disruption that has occurred for children. And there's a decision coming up soon by the JCVI, the body which decides when and who gets the vaccinations. And there is some suggestion that certainly those aged 16 and over could get the jab at some point over the summer holidays. Obviously, that's the exam cohorts at the top of secondary who it would obviously benefit the most directly, being able to stay in school and not have to go home and learn, via remote learning every few weeks. So, watch this space for that. But I think that's certainly going to be an interesting one coming up in the weeks ahead. Yeah,
and Pippa, we'll stay with you. Front page of the Daily Mail, bring it on, Javid fights for freedom. Harry's touched on his thoughts on the performance today of Sajid Javid. But, I mean, what an in-tray he's starting with. Is he the right man for the job, do you think?
He really does, doesn't he? I mean, he's certainly respected by his peers, and I've noticed more than one Tory MP saying that he's somebody who says the same thing privately as he does publicly, which I think many would regard as a welcome change from some of what we hear from government. But it was very obvious, and Harry's touched on this, a very striking change in tone from him. I mean, he's obviously much more of a sort of a cabinet hawk than Matt Hancock, his predecessor, was when it comes to lifting lockdown restrictions. It was always Hancock who seemed to be on the front line, urging caution, urging people not to go too far, to sort of make wise decisions. Some would now say, ironically, given some of the decisions he's made himself. But Sajid Javid is obviously somebody who regards July 19th as the terminus date, as the Prime Minister has set out, but that is set in stone. I mean, he was suggesting today that it was going to be irreversible, that there's no going back. But it's dangerous. That's dangerous for the government as well, because it sounds very much like a hostage to fortune. And if they get to the point where this rise in cases, yes, we're not seeing deaths resulting from this rise in cases, thanks to the vaccine programme. We get some more hospital data tomorrow to see whether there's an impact on hospitalisations. But if it gets to the point where people are being affected very badly because of the surge in cases, then, who knows? Maybe we could see, if there's a new variant, for example, coming in, we could see restrictions brought back in future. So it's quite a big promise to make that there aren't going to be any changes and this is irreversible. And we have, as Harry mentioned, been here before with this government, and the public, I think, wouldn't take too kindly to being once again promised something and then being told actually it wasn't going to happen after all.
Yeah, you mentioned Mr. Hancock. We'll talk more about that after the break. But Harry, let's turn to the front of the Financial Times. JAVID shifts tone on curbs in call for nation to learn to live with COVID. As Pippa was saying, a real change in tone. But the danger is, isn't it, that if he starts talking about dates rather than data, then it is sort of going back on what the government has said up till now.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a really interesting sort of battle to come, actually, in the coming hours and days, really. And we saw a little overture of this yesterday in the fact that, as a cabinet minister, you're not just representing your own views, you are also representing the views of your department. And the health secretary is representing the views of the NHS, the views of the scientists, the views of the doctors. So, you sometimes always have to park your own sort of slightly libertarian streak, perhaps, and represent the views of your department. Everyone's talking about how Rishi Sunak was very bullish about lifting lockdown restrictions, but he was also representing the Treasury. He was also speaking on behalf of the economic impacts and things like that. So it'd be really interesting to see how it plays out for Mr. JAVID in the coming days, of whether he will be actually slightly tempered by the institution he's just walked into. He's pretty much worked in every government department so far, except for health. And it is a big, institution, and it has, it is bigger than one man. It is bigger than one Secretary of State. So it'd be really interesting to see whether he slightly tempers and tones it down a little bit. We saw his first little sort of skirmish of that yesterday. When he arrived at the department, he did a clip, and it was very bullish about getting back to a normality as quickly as possible. And he was very optimistic, very upbeat about being able to do that. But then when the Department for Health officials press released later on in the day what was meant to be his formal quote, they'd literally gutted it. And it was very bland. And it suggested actually it was, obviously we'd like to go back to normal one day. They removed all the optimism out of it. And I just think there's going to be a really interesting, for sort of political observers like Pippa and I, there could be a really interesting battle there, because he's a very strong-willed individual, as he saw at the Home Office, and whether he comes up against the machine could be quite spicy.
Yeah, because of course the health secretary may have changed, but the advisors and the experts and the mandarins haven't. And Pippa, just 30 seconds really before we take a break. Front page of the Eye, 19th of July, end of the line for lockdown, similar theme. But as Labour's John Ashworth said today, he asked Sajid Javid about all the other things that he's got to deal with: cancer backlogs, social care, reorganisation of the NHS. And Javid did talk about a fair pay settlement, didn't he, for the NHS? I wonder if we're going to see a U-turn there, maybe.
Well, this is coming up very soon. The pay review body is going to recommend to the government what nurses in particular has been concentrating on are going to get. And nurses have reacted incredibly angrily by the suggestion that they get a 1% pay rise, which is in fact a real terms cut. So, political mood music might suggest if Sajid Javid comes into the new job and wants to kind of get people on side, that he might decide that actually it'd be good to increase that pay offer. But let's see what the review body says, because ultimately I think it will come down to that.
OK, thank you both for the moment. Plenty more still to come, as if Harry Kane needed any more pressure. This is the Front of the Sun. We'll have more on that in a moment. Welcome back. Pippa and Harry still with us. Harry, let's look at the front page of the Metro. First time we've seen you since that remarkable scoop by The Sun. And, of course, it still rumbles on. Now Boris rewrites history. Did the Prime Minister back or sack Matt Hancock then? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's no doubt that there was an effort to try and save Matt Hancock last Friday. The government line was this is a private matter. That fell apart pretty quickly once Hancock realised he was banged to rights, as they say in the trade. They then tried to say, oh, well, I'm sorry, I broke lockdown rules. But then I think overnight on Friday, I think probably everyone slightly realised the level of anger was heading towards Cummings levels of Barnard Castle on speed, really. And I don't know who picked up the phone first to who, but, I imagine by the time that Matt Hancock arrived at Chequers, the writing was on the wall, so shall we say? In the speed of political scandals, 48 hours isn't massive. Alistair Campbell was used to say, if you're still on the front page after 11 days, that's when it's time to cut the guy ropes. So I think the inevitable result was the writing was on the wall pretty early on, but they got there in the end.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Pippa, isn't it? Do you think the Hancock scandal will sort of die away now as we approach July the 19th and people focus on that?
I think Boris Johnson will hope so, but it was a spectacular attempt to try and rewrite history. The Prime Minister today suggesting that he had in fact sacked Matt Hancock, and then Number 10 saying just minutes later that in fact it hadn't been the case, that he'd resigned. And I think that raises questions about whether the Prime Minister wants to lead the public or indeed be led by public opinion, which is something he's grappled with in the past and I think we'll continue to see. But yes, Jonathan, I think you're right. I think a lot of the focus now going forward, once again, Boris Johnson proving himself very lucky as a politician, will be focusing on July the 19th and resumption of a more normal life as restrictions are lifted.
Yeah, OK. And let's finish with the front of the Sun, Harry. Come on, Harry. Even Hancock scored is the cheeky headline there. And we just heard France knocked out tonight, lost on penalties to Switzerland. Just very quick, 10 seconds, Harry.
I have to be very careful what I say. My French girlfriend is incredibly upset right now. But, if we can beat the Germans tomorrow with the favourites, the French out, who knows what could happen. Could be quite the summer.